A few years ago, when Ranger Mike was still fairly new to the job, something happened that he never quite forgot. He was stationed in the Great Smoky Mountains at the time, a park known for its high visitor traffic, especially during the summer months. But this was early spring, and things were still relatively quiet. That's when the first campers and hikers start trickling in, those who want to beat the crowds. Springtime in the Smokies can be peaceful, but the weather is unpredictable, and the trails are still rugged from winter. On this particular day, Mike was out on a routine patrol. He had been assigned to check in on one of the more remote trails, a place where people tended to go if they really wanted to escape. It wasn't a long trail by any means, but it was deep in the woods, far from any main roads or the more popular campsites. The park preferred to keep an eye on those areas to ensure visitors didn't stray too far or get into trouble. But most people knew better than to take on the more secluded trails alone. Mike had been walking for a while, checking trail markers and making sure there were no signs of illegal camping or off-trail hiking. As the day wore on, the sky started to cloud over, and the light drizzle that had started that morning turned into something heavier. It wasn't an ideal day for hiking, but it was part of the job. He took note of the wet leaves and mud as he made his way deeper into the woods. It was about mid-afternoon when Mike noticed something unusual. Up ahead on the trail, maybe 20 or 30 yards out, he saw a figure. From a distance, it looked like a man, standing still, facing away from him. The figure wasn't moving, and there was no sign of a backpack or any gear. Mike thought this was strange to say the least. Most hikers would have heard him coming, or at least reacted to the sound of someone approaching. He called out, "Hey, everything okay up there?" But the figure didn't respond, didn't even turn around. Mike quickened his pace, moving cautiously as he got closer. The rain was falling harder now, making the forest seem even darker and more oppressive. When he was about 10 yards away, the figure finally moved. The man turned around slowly, but he didn't make eye contact with Mike. Instead, he just stared down at the ground. Mike could see that the man was wearing old, tattered clothes, not the type of gear you'd expect someone to be hiking in. His face was pale, and he looked like he hadn't slept in days. "Sir, are you okay?" Mike asked again, this time more firmly. The man finally looked up, meeting Mike's gaze, but there was something off about his expression. His eyes seemed vacant, almost hollow, like he wasn't fully there. Then, without a word, the man turned and started walking off the trail, disappearing into the underbrush. Mike was about to follow, but something in his gut told him not to. Protocol would usually be to make sure the person was okay, but this situation felt different, off. Instead, he radioed back to the ranger station, explaining what he had seen and asking if anyone else had reported an unusual hiker in the area. The response came back negative. No one else had seen anyone matching the description Mike gave, and no hikers were unaccounted for in that part of the park. Mike stood there for a moment, debating what to do. He considered heading into the woods to track the man, but the trail was already slippery from the rain, and it was getting late. He decided to stick to the path, knowing he could return to the station and file a report. Maybe send someone back out in the morning when the weather was better. As he turned to continue down the trail, something strange caught his attention. Where the man had been standing, there were no footprints. The ground was muddy. His own boots had left clear marks in the soft earth, but there was no sign that anyone else had been there. No prints leading off the trail, no disturbed leaves, nothing. Mike felt his blood turn cold, even though the air was still warm from the day. He scanned the woods, but the man was gone, and the rain was falling harder now, making it harder to see. Not wanting to stick around any longer, he picked up his pace and headed back toward his truck. When he reached the parking lot at the trailhead, it was nearly dusk. Mike reported what he had seen to his supervisor, but there wasn't much they could do. They agreed to send another ranger out the next day to check the area, just in case. But no one ever found any trace of the man. No lost or missing persons were reported in that part of the park, and no one else saw anything unusual on that trail. In the following weeks, Mike couldn't make heads or tails of what had happened. He knew what he saw, a man standing on the trail, But the fact that there were no footprints made him question the entire thing. Was it possible he imagined it? Maybe. But Mike had been in the woods long enough to know the difference between his imagination and reality. Over time, he moved on from it. But every once in a while, especially when he's hiking alone, he thinks back to that day. He never saw the man again, and no other reports came in from that area. But whenever he passes that part of the trail, he finds himself looking over his shoulder, just to feel 100% safe. Some people in the park said it might have been a ghost, an old hiker, or someone who got lost in the woods a long time ago. Mike doesn't believe in that kind of thing, or at least he didn't used to. Now he's not so sure. It was mid-September when Tom headed out for a camping trip in the Big Thicket National Preserve in Texas. The forest was a mix of pine and hardwood, with dense underbrush that made the place feel untouched, almost ancient. Tom had grown up in Houston, and over the years, he'd made a habit of exploring the sprawling preserve. It was only about a 2-hour drive from the city, and he found it to be a favorite trip for him. But this time, he decided to go alone, something he'd never done before. The Big Thicket is known for its diversity in plant and animal life, but it's also known for something a little more eerie: local legends. Over the years, he'd heard plenty of strange stories about the place. Tales of wild men, strange lights, and cryptid sightings were common enough. But Tom wasn't one for superstitions. He was a practical guy. He liked the quiet, the challenge of hiking long trails, and the satisfaction of a weekend unplugged. Tom arrived at his chosen spot around mid-afternoon. He was deep into the thicket, on a less traveled path that wound through cypress swamps and dense groves of pines. It was a few miles away from any official campground, but that's exactly what he wanted: seclusion. His campsite was a small clearing surrounded by trees, with a nearby stream trickling just a few yards away. He set up his tent, gathered some firewood, and settled in. Everything was calm, almost peaceful, as the sun began to dip below the tree line. As dusk approached, Tom built a fire and cooked a simple meal. The night was cold, typical for this time of year, and the temperature seemed to drop quickly as darkness settled in. The woods were quiet, too quiet, but Tom figured it was just because he was so deep in the wilderness. No wind, no rustling leaves, just the distant hum of insects. It was around 9 p.m. when things started to feel off. At first, it was subtle, like an uneasy feeling creeping in. Tom had been sitting by the fire reading a paperback when he heard a distant sound, like something moving through the brush. It wasn't the usual small rustling you'd expect from squirrels or birds, but heavier, like a large animal. He stopped reading and listened. Nothing. A minute passed, and then he heard it again, this time closer, a deliberate crack of a branch. Tom stood up and scanned the edge of the clearing. The firelight only reached so far, and beyond that, the woods were pitch black. He grabbed his flashlight and pointed it into the trees, but the beam only cut through a small portion of the dense forest. Still, he saw nothing out of the ordinary. Tom had camped enough to know the sounds of wildlife. Maybe it was just a deer, he told himself, but he couldn't shake the growing sense of unease. He sat back down, telling himself it was nothing, but he kept the flashlight close. Another hour passed, and by then, the fire had burned down to embers. He decided to call it a night. After dousing the fire, he crawled into his tent and zipped up the flap. The cold was more noticeable inside the tent, and the silence outside felt even heavier. He lay on his back, staring up at the nylon ceiling, listening for any sound, but everything seemed still again. Just as he was drifting off to sleep, a loud, sharp scream echoed through the forest. It wasn't a human scream, but it wasn't exactly an animal either. It sounded like a mix of a coyote's yelp and something much deeper. It chilled Tom to the bone. He sat up immediately, heart pounding, and grabbed his flashlight. The scream came again, this time even closer. Tom unzipped the tent and shined the flashlight into the clearing. His breath hung in the air, the cold night biting at his skin. For a moment, everything was quiet. Then, just at the edge of the beam, he saw something move. It was fast, too fast for him to make out what it was. But it was big, taller than a man. The flashlight barely caught a glimpse of it before it disappeared into the trees. Tom's first instinct was to grab his knife from his backpack. He wasn't exactly sure what he'd just seen, but whatever it wasn't something he wanted to meet face to face. He listened intently, hoping whatever it was had just passed through. But that unsettling scream came again. This time, it seemed to come from all around him, echoing through the forest. Trying to stay calm, Tom scanned the area with the flashlight again. That's when he noticed something truly terrifying. Tracks. They were fresh, leading into the clearing from the trees, and then out again. But the shape of them wasn't right. They were long, with what looked like clawed toes, but the stride was too wide for any known animal. Tom's mind raced, trying to make sense of it. He knew there were no large predators in the area, no bears or mountain lions in this part of Texas. But these tracks weren't anything he could recognize. They didn't belong to any animal he knew of, and they certainly weren't human. The wind started to pick up, rustling the trees. It was then he heard a low sound that was deep and unnatural. It was closer now, much closer. Tom spun around, the flashlight shaking in his hand. At the edge of the clearing, just beyond the reach of the light, he saw it again. This time, he could make out its shape. A tall, hunched figure, with elongated limbs and dark, matted fur. Its eyes reflected the light, glowing a sickly yellow in the darkness. It stood there watching him, its head cocked slightly, as if curious. Tom's breath caught in his throat. He had heard the stories about skinwalkers, creatures from Navajo legend that could shapeshift into animals or even take on human forms. But that was just folklore, wasn't it? Yet here it was, staring him down. In a panic, Tom backed toward his tent, not daring to take his eyes off the creature. His mind screamed at him to run, but he couldn't move a muscle. The creature took a step forward, its long limbs moving with unnatural fluidity. That's when Tom made a break for it. He didn't bother grabbing his gear. He just bolted, flashlight in hand, sprinting down the trail that led back toward his car. As he ran, he could hear the creature crashing through the underbrush behind him, keeping pace with every step. The sound of its growls grew louder, closer, and Tom pushed himself harder, his lungs burning from the cold air. The trail twisted and turned, and more than once, he stumbled, nearly falling. But he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. After what felt like an eternity, he finally saw the dim outline of his truck through the trees. Without looking back, he sprinted the last few yards, yanked the door open, and threw himself inside. The growling stopped, and the forest fell silent again. Tom didn't wait to find out if the creature was still there. He started the truck and tore out of the big thicket, not slowing down until he was miles away. Only then did he pull over, hands shaking, trying to catch his breath. He never went back to that part of the big thicket again. To this day, Tom doesn't know exactly what he saw that night. He's heard other stories since, other people claiming to have seen strange things in the thicket. Whether it was a skinwalker or something else, he'll never forget that feeling, that something ancient and malevolent was watching him, stalking him through the dark Texas woods. It was late in the summer of 2018, and I was working as a park ranger in the Allegheny National Forest in Pennsylvania. It's a massive place, covering over 500,000 acres, full of dense woods and remote trails. One of the quieter spots is the Morrison Trail, which doesn't see much traffic. Most people who come out this far either know exactly what they're doing or are looking to avoid the busier camping areas. It's not uncommon for a ranger like me to go days without seeing anyone in that part of the forest. One evening, I was at the ranger station, getting ready to close up, when a camper came in. He looked rattled, not the usual tired or sunburned kind of look we often see after a day in the woods. He seemed genuinely spooked. I offered him a chair and asked what was going on. He hesitated, then said he'd been camping near the Morrison Trail and thought something, or someone, was out there watching him. "Watching you?" I asked, trying to get more details. "Yeah," he said, his voice low. "I don't know, man. I thought it was just me being paranoid, but I kept hearing things like footsteps and, I don't know, I saw something. Now, I've been working this job for a while, and you hear all kinds of stories, especially from people who aren't used to the solitude out here. The woods can play tricks on your mind, especially at night, but there was something about the way this guy was talking that made me take him seriously. He wasn't just some first-time camper spooked by the dark. "What did you see?" I asked, leaning in a bit. He took a deep breath and said it was big, much bigger than a person. He only caught a glimpse of it, but whatever it was moved fast, too fast to be a bear. He swore it was circling his campsite and making these weird noises, low growls that didn't sound like any animal he knew. I've heard enough stories to know that not everything people see or hear in the woods has a simple explanation. Could have been a bear, sure, but bears usually stay away from people unless they're after food, and they don't make a habit of stalking campers. Still, I figured I should check it out. "Do you want me to go take a look?" I asked. He nodded, clearly relieved someone was going to investigate. I grabbed my gear and told him to hang tight at the station. He wasn't interested in going back, which I couldn't blame him for. The Morrison Trail was about a 30-minute drive from where we were, and by the time I got there, it was well after dark. I pulled up to the trailhead, grabbed my flashlight and radio, and headed down the path toward where the camper said he had set up. It was quiet, almost too quiet. Usually, even at night, you'd hear some rustling in the bushes or the distant call of an owl, but not tonight. When I reached his campsite, everything seemed in order at first. His tent was still there, his fire pit cold. But as I walked around the site, I noticed the ground had been disturbed. There were deep prints in the dirt, like something heavy had been moving through the area. I bent down to get a closer look, but the ground was too hard to make out any clear tracks. Whatever it was, though, it was big, no doubt about it. Then I heard it, a snap, like a branch breaking somewhere off in the trees. I stood up, shining my flashlight in the direction of the sound. At first, I didn't see anything, but then, just beyond the reach of the light, I caught a glimpse of movement. Something was there, something tall, moving between the trees. I called out, "Who's there?" But all I got in return was silence. I stayed still for a moment, listening, trying to figure out if it was a bear or something else. Then I heard it again, that low growl the camper had mentioned. It echoed through the woods, but I couldn't pin down where it was coming from. It didn't sound like any bear I'd ever heard. I've encountered bears plenty of times in this job, and this was different. I moved toward the edge of the campsite, shining my light into the trees, and that's when I saw it, a shadow darting between the trunks, just out of reach of the beam. It was fast, too fast for me to get a good look. I've been out in these woods for years, and I've never seen anything move like that. For a moment, everything went quiet again. I could feel my pulse in my ears as I stood there, waiting, listening. Then, from behind me, I heard another snap, much closer this time. I spun around, but whatever it was had already disappeared into the darkness. That's when I decided it was time to leave. I radioed back to the station, letting them know what I had found, or rather, what I hadn't found. I didn't want to say too much over the radio, not until I could make sense of it myself. On the way back to my truck, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something following me. But nothing ever showed itself, although I really think there was something close the whole time. When I got back to the station, the camper was still there looking anxious. I told him I didn't find any signs of people. No one was stalking him, at least not in the way he feared. But I didn't tell him about the shadow, the growl, or the prints. Some things are better left unsaid, especially when there's no good explanation for them. After that night, I kept an eye on the Morrison Trail, but nothing like that ever happened again. At least, not that I heard about. The camper left the next morning and never returned. I haven't seen him since. And as for whatever was out there that night, I still don't know. Maybe it was just my imagination, or maybe there's something in those woods that we don't fully understand. Either way, I'm more cautious when I head out there alone. I still do my job, patrolling the trails, checking on campsites. But every now and then, when I'm deep in the forest, I'll catch a glimpse of movement in the distance, or hear a strange sound in the night, and I'm reminded of that night on the Morrison Trail.